Sounds good.
I am really happy to be here today with Matt and Michael, and we are going to tackle part 4 of Radical Orthodoxy's basic principles. And I'm going to start by reading the paragraph that's kind of a summary of the 4th principle. And then I'm going to ask a question of these two geniuses and see what they can come up with. As for Dionysius the Areopagite, modern Russian theology, and even the Puritan divine William Ames, this means that theology issues in Theurgy, a cooperation between human and divine work, which is nonetheless entirely the work of God. Attempts to think about God are superseded in the supreme work of human making and exchange, which is the liturgy. Here, a collective human action invites the divine descent. So when I tackled this paragraph, the first thing that I wanted to know is, what is Theurgy? And so I was doing a lot of reading about that, and it's a really big topic, and I wondered if you guys could just rein it in for me and help me to understand it as a, basic idea.
I mean, I think I'll give my attempt at it here first, but I mean, I think it's summed up well in that paragraph, right? It's this cooperation.
Michael, you're so funny. That paragraph doesn't mean anything. Unless you understand every word in it, the paragraph doesn't mean anything. And to you, it's so obvious. So I just love that about you. But anyway, let's start word by word and work our way.
So there is a complexity to it. I agree. But it is this working together with us. And it something is really wrapped up deep in there, which is this complexity between God's divine will and our human will, and what are we allowed to do within that? And so so it says, here's exactly what it says here. It says a cooperation between human and divine work, which is nonetheless entirely the work of God.
Okay, so that's his definition of theurgy. But when you look up, like in Stanford website of philosophy, or when you even look at Wikipedia, their definition of theurgy is more that it's a some sort of magical effort to make your way with God.
Right. So referring specifically to the sort of rites you perform that invoke God's presence, right? Which is,
but as I understood it, not just like the liturgy in the church, but kind of going beyond that and outside of that to something more connected to invoking magical power to accomplish your purposes. And I see Matt nodding. Is that?
Certainly. There are two strains I would want to connect to the conclusion you made. One, there's this history of radical orthodoxy, which began with a book, more or less a thesis by the name of the man I can't remember at the moment.
John Milbank.
Thank you. Theology and Social Practice or something like that, where he famously has a sentence, I don't know if it's the beginning, the middle, or near the end, where he says, once there was no secular. Okay.
Yes.
That's one inroad to what you're talking about with the magic, because there is a long parallel track to the Christian Eucharist, which is, I'll put my foot in the door and say that's a place where we see this magic invocation to the Holy Spirit to make this bread and this wine the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ that we imbibe. And it plays with the idea of casting a spell. There's a particular word for it in the Roman Rite. But underneath that, there's this long parallel, or not so quite parallel, tradition of the Hermetic, where there is a series of literatures. This goes back to Egypt, of spells that can be cast by priests that is supposed to liven up inanimate matter for purposes beyond the mundane. And I think that's part of where you're coming from, Karen, in this kind of overgloss, which it is, because theurgy lived and breathed outside of Christian articulation. And just like many temples are on top of the ruins of pagan centers, this word itself is standing in the shadow of myths and hermetic philosophies before it.
Okay, so Michael, is Milbank trying to use it in a new way, or is he trying to reanimate the word or the idea with a strictly Christian perspective?
He's kind of trying to do both, right, simultaneously, which is why the careful word determination here, which, because there's an aspect of this that he assigns to the human. So there's something that there's a voluntary, willful portion or contribution of the human that nevertheless is subsumed into something that at its final point is completely God's work. It's completely what he wanted from the start, even though we are contributing something to it. So it's and a better way to think about this too is, is within the context of these other points we've been going through, which is that he's trying to re-knit together a world that has been sundered, right? The secular and the sacred world that have been kind of ripped apart in the modern frame, and trying to say that distinction which occurs in our mind doesn't actually exist in reality. That is, this sort of movement that begins in the Middle Ages, where we start to see God kind of separated from the creation, in ways that ultimately culminate with a sort of deistic model of the universe, the sort of clockmaker's universe, where we imagine God kind of winds things up. He creates this, intricate mechanism that doesn't really need his involvement for it to go, and then he walks away, and then kind of what things occur from there, kind of within that sort of that mechanistic model. And then the further move from that is atheism itself, right? Which is, well, once you have this mechanism that doesn't need anything to make it go, you don't really need the watchmaker anymore.
Okay,
right?
so Matt wants to add something in there, and then we'll get back to this. So Matt, what were you?
Yeah, just as a point of seeing perhaps where the players are making these moves that Michael described, at that moment of before the deistic reflection, there was the mechanism put forward at the table. And before you have the mechanism put forward at the table, you have to have a sniffing or a sense of a clue that there is rock bottom, that there is an ultimate design that can be found in this life if we only peered long enough and hard enough at reality. And I would say this historically began with the project of Thales. He was a famous pre-Socratic philosopher
Mathematician,
who famously
right?
began the journey to the arche, the first principle of all things. Now, what he did that was different was he assumed the arche, the first principle, was in the created order, and so he could locate it in time and space. He happened to equivocate it with water. But the project has been ongoing of finding the first principle in nature. And then I think Michael's right that this eventually leads to enough frustration that we become nihilists and call God nothing in the sky, the atheism move.
Mm-hmm. That was great clarification. Thanks. Let's keep going, Michael.
Yeah. So to move forward to what we're talking about here, is all this is taking place in a framework where he's trying to say that that there is not this sharp distinction between reason and faith, or reason and revelation, or grace and nature, right? That God is and this kind of plays in well with Jordan Peterson and Paul's God one, God number two, right? Where you have the transcendent God that is personal, and you have this immanent God that is just sort of the sum total of everything. That he's saying he's trying to bring these two versions of God back together. And then now that he's already done that with the earlier points, he's trying to see what are the consequences of that as it relates to the ways in which we come to know God, the ways in which theology is done. What's actually, how does this transpire? Is this something we undertake, or is this God's work in and through his own self-disclosure? That is, and what he's saying here is it's both, right?
Well, one of the intros that I was listening to, a fellow by the name of Simon Oliver was doing a little intro to Radical Orthodoxy. And he mentioned that when Aquinas was talking about theology, the meaning of theology at that time was God and all things as they relate to God. So theology included everything, included every study, every discipline. It was all under that one framework. And that over time, theology's gotten pushed out more and more and more to be just its own little thing off to the side. And that one of the moves that Radical Orthodoxy is trying to do is become radically interdisciplinary and bring every discipline under the auspices of well, kind of the project I've been working on, really. How do you see in every scientific endeavor and in every in all of history and in all psychological moves, where is God showing up in those things? And so it kind of seems to me like that's what he's talking about. You know, I can only see it within my own frame because I don't have the philosophical background that you two guys have. But
well, Karen, I think you so succinctly put your finger on two projects. One that Jonathan Peugeot is actively doing, currently doing, and then the Radical Orthodoxy. So the Radical Orthodoxy says, come out of the dark periphery where there are monsters theology and assume your rightful place in the here and now, the happenings of entities and beings. And then Jonathan Peugeot will say, yes, bring it to the center, but then pull the center up. So remember that image you had months ago, like for the meaning code, and establish hierarchy and interdisciplinary so that there's an unfolding effect in these speculations.
Yeah. When you were talking earlier about, theology's central place, it was related as the queen of the sciences, right? It was the reason the universities came into being, which would, again, were places of higher learning, right? And somehow, they've been stripped away as kind of unnecessary and certainly not central towards our understanding of reality. And certainly, what he's saying here, Milbank, is it is central to all of our doing, right? All of our making. In some sense, what he's saying is all human making and doing is subsumed and is sacred. Whether it is specifically aimed at God or not. And I think that's why, I was actually listening to that video you shared with me a little bit ago, and it was with the one you shared about Milbank, and he talks about how, in some sense, the reason Jesus is the only human that ever was is because he's divine and human at the same time. That there's something in the sort of the blueprint of what it is to be a human that necessarily points to beyond itself, to the supernatural. And this is kind of present there in Augustine, where he says, God, you've made us for us, and our hearts find no rest until they find their rest in you. There's something in us that necessarily points in this direction, and we're in a sort of we're in a story that's not yet complete. We're in the sort of process of being made into humans, and so that there's a progression that's taking place that God himself is orchestrating, and yet we are also co-authoring what's being done there. And yet at the end, it's subsumed in God's plot and his story that he's writing.
So I think there's an interesting accident of history that Maps of Meaning was written and published and lectured upon around the same time as the Radical Orthodoxy anthologies were being developed in the conversations between the academics and the conventions, because I think it's symbolic of two approaches to this storied life, right? You have the pastiche method of drawing together multiple different strains from multiple different mythologies and places and historical epochs, and from literature. That's the Maps of Meaning, to try to then boil it down to ought is distinction. Here's where we are, there's where we ought to be. Life is a journey led by the hero, and we need a canon to get there, a bunch of ethos. So all the things that are in Maps of Meaning. But then you also have this sense of pink stocks in Radical Orthodoxy, ordinary versus extraordinary time. Almost that middle ground from what is to what ought to be, where life is liturgically practiced for someday, not just practicing at the best, but being in the game, which is the afterlife, which is the recapitulation.
We lost you there. We lost you there for a second, and you said something about life is liturgically practiced. You were talking about Catherine Pickstock, and you said life is liturgically practiced so that the ordinary and extraordinary time. Is that what you said?
Precisely. So those are phrases for liturgical movements in Mass. For example, how I'm using it, this idea of the pastiche of Jordan B. Peterson's book and the Radical Orthodoxy movement, is in the ordinary, extraordinary time, there is liturgical practice for, in this way, someone's practicing the bat, getting a bunch of softballs, curveballs, things thrown at them along the way. Peterson would understand this from a cybernetic perspective. You've got them, you go to that place, and you have all the confrontations. Liturgically, that's understood as mere practice for the afterlife, where you have the recapitulation of Michael's divine and human together, where there will be the effort, strain under sin. But in order to access that now like a portal, you literally have to, you take your mind out of the practice and just do it. And I think that's kind of where modernism ran off the rails. It wanted to just be aware that it was practicing a pattern. But liturgically, you have to cast aside knowing that you're practicing the pattern and just do it. And maybe that's Peterson's actions, Pingstock's conception of liturgy.
Well, would this connect up with covenantal epistemology, with this idea that in order to ever truly know something, you have to have a relationship with the thing that you know, whether it's learning to ride a bicycle or learning to play baseball or learning to take care of a rose bush or learning any sort of a new skill or learning God's word. There has to be a loving relationship between you and the thing you're learning in order for it to become a part, in order to connect up with all the parts of who you are. So when Michael was connecting
of the part, the poetry is
when Michael was talking earlier about the human always points to the supernatural. The picture that I was thinking about is this idea I've had for a long time. Other people call it something else, but I call it my experiential DNA. All the things that make me who I am, all my experiences growing up and messages that I've heard and songs that I've sung and environments that I've been in and relationships I've had with people, all of those things created, well, first of all, there had to be some sort of schemata inside me for those things to hook up to when they became a part of me. And all of those things have connections that are out there, so that every time I have a new conversation or a new experience, those connections are being made. So I'm constantly being built. And ultimately, all of those connections are there because I'm supposed to ultimately be filled with Christ, and all those connections connect up in Him. But because my DNA, experiential DNA, is unique to me, Christ in me is also unique, and Christ in you is unique, and Christ in Michael is unique. And that's how we are different from other religions. In some other religions, when you become one with the all in all, you disappear. But in Christianity, when you become one with Christ, you are one of the unique members of the body, right? It's all those connections that are in us. And that's why it's so important when we know someone, that we don't try to get into their life and make their life for them, because God is working in their life. It's not my job to be somebody else's Holy Spirit, right? We all, the connections that we're building, that there's a purpose in that, which seems to me it ties up with what you were talking about, Matt, about life being liturgically practiced, so that it creates this space between ordinary and extraordinary time. Am I on the right track?
That was beautifully said. I still like what you did with the Holy Spirit there. It replaces the need for a guru, because the Holy Spirit is our person. Not he's given to the assembly, and he is a person, and he is personal. And wow, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, that was really well spoken. And I liked your emphasis on this sort of hidden structure, these sort of web of relationships that are of a kind that are in some sense you, even more so than the you we can look at and have a kind of superficial knowing of, right? There's this sort of deep structure that we can only sort of, get to know in a process through time and sort of self-sacrifice, right? That's how we get to know anybody. And that sort of part of what that intimates to me too is and I know this is something I'm always hung up on, but God's sort of unfolding self-sacrifice in terms of his involvement in each of the kind of idiosyncrasy of those connections you're referring to, and that he is crafting something bespoke and unique to your story and all the things that are in your past and yet still to come in your future. And it's just a marvelous picture of God's caring about all these details that we oftentimes look at as accidental and insignificant and peripheral to the main event. And I think part of what John Milbank is gesturing towards is saying, oh, you should actually be looking at these details to see God.
Looking at the
And
details.
this, I think, is one salvo.
Well, I just want to clarify this one thing. Looking at the details of your life, of your own life, or looking at the details of how God interacts with you. Was that the point?
No, I think like it's the details of everything. Like
Okay.
in some sense, what he's saying, it's sort of like, the Psalm where he says, where can I go away from your presence, God? I can go into hell itself, into Sheol, and you are there. I can go to the highest mountain and you're there. And this is a sort of, I don't know, a propositional reflection on the ways in which that is true, and that God is really participating with all this stuff around us in time and space.
Okay. Yeah. That I wanted to get that fleshed out. So Matt, you were going to say?
In the God and God 2 that we've been re-articulating, there is in the center a recognition that sola scriptura doesn't work on its own merits, but a kernel of that idea does work for all creation. So providentially, every atom is ordered in the same way that a rubric in a mass or in a liturgy tells you what to do and what to say. Why? Because you need to hold what to say do. No.
Okay,
But you want to.
Matt.
Yeah.
I think you need to back away from your computer a little bit, because whenever you move towards it, the sound starts breaking up.
Oh, my apologies. Better now.
Well, I don't know if it's space or, because it's an odd thing. We get most of what you're saying, but we miss all the consonants.
Oh, that's strange.
Yes.
Weird.
So
Maybe
It's
just
okay.
So can you go back and say the idea again and just slow down a little bit and stay back from the computer and see if that makes it better.
Are you
Okay.
connected via Wi-Fi
Yeah, I'll
or
try
your,
right here. I
your
apologize.
phone?
No.
So Michael was asking you a technical question.
I was just asking if you're connected via Wi-Fi or the phone's internet, or do you have a good connection?
Phone's in it, yeah.
Okay.
I do, but I think it's
You're good
waning.
now. You're good now.
I think
For
my
whatever
battery
reason.
life. What?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just pointing out you're good now. I think there was just maybe you had a bad connection there.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I just won't move forward or back. So what I was saying was the God one, God two. In the center of that is I think the refutation of sola scriptura, but it preserves the kernel of truth in sola scriptura if it's brought out to the broadest base. That is to say, all creation bespeaks a kind of causality, a providential causality. And so in liturgy, you have a rubric where you're told what to do and what to say. Is that because we need to be told what to do or say? No. But by doing the thing we're told, and by saying the thing we're told, actually disposing the will to
I'm losing you again. And you're saying something really important and I lost you. So you said liturgy tells us what to do and say. And by doing the thing we're told, by saying the thing we're told, something
You're
happens.
disposing yourself to, I guess, providential something. That's where he broke up.
You're training the will to choose the good by your volition without having to doubt or self-generate the path of the good. It's literally being taken back to the garden and said, remember in the garden, I used to think it's a story about prohibition, but it's really, in my opinion, a story about liturgy, because they're given a rule to live by. Eat all of these and don't eat this one. It's a rule. It's a way that would give meaning to every single step they took. It actually gave will, not just the eyes or the mouth, something to do. Every time they were choosing a good tree, they were participating in the story. Even if they chose the bad tree, they were participating in the story. But the will wasn't engaged correctly, and so it was less than, but it was still in the story.
Wow, okay, my brain is just exploding. So many ideas that I don't even know where to go with it. And I'm just going to put some place markers here so that I can remember later on. Yesterday, I had a conversation with Brett, who had been on Paul's channel a couple of weeks ago, and Brett is very knowledgeable about the whole maps of meaning thing, and he has this idea about entropy, about evil and entropy, and the overlap between evil and entropy. And and then you said that about the good fruit and the bad fruit, and how in each choice that we make, we are participating. Wow. And so it's like Jordan Peterson always says, every choice you make is consequential, either for the building of a better universe or the destruction of the universe. And of course, that ties up with all of C.S. Lewis's teaching as well, that you're either becoming something closely approximating a shining, bright angel, or you're becoming something closely approximating a monster. With every choice that you make, you're moving one direction or the other. But I love that idea that those choices, in a sense, that is all liturgical. I mean, maybe that's what Milbank is trying to say, is that life itself is liturgical. It's not just that you have to have liturgy in church in order to accomplish this connection between the human and divine, but that life itself, if life itself is lived out in a liturgical manner, it has this effect.
Yeah, I think he's making the point that that whether you like it or not, you're engaging in this, right? That you are in this act of making an exchange, as he says. You're participating in the liturgy all the time. That there are these divine consequences for everything you're just in some sense, and I think this follows from the idea that God Himself is here, immanent in creation. So, in some sense, any good you do is magnified by that divine presence, and any bad you do is also kind of magnified. There's a sort of gravity to everything we do because of that divine presence.
Mhm.
And I think that's part of what he's gesturing towards. But then also there, how it ends here is very interesting too, right? He says here a collective human action invites the divine descent. So there's something about when we come together and we set our face to the same objective. And I think that what he's referring to isn't just the act of coming together in church, although there is something higher and more sacred in that activity. But in any sort of, even in a conversation like ours now, where there's something of the divine presence that is attracted to the human collective effort in a special way, that and this kind of makes a lot of sense to me, because it's something, I thought, very early on when I was watching some of your early conversations, Karen, and what attracted me to your channel was it felt like there was something about the nature of the conversations you were having that was doing exactly that, that was in sort of invoking God to come in and kind of point to certain things, and allow, and this is sort of what Vervaeke refers to as the dialogos, right? This sort of something in the exchange between two entities, that God kind of comes in the middle, and in spite of all the imperfections, in spite of the imperfections in our language and our motives and everything else, we're able to transcend them all, and something real is accomplished in terms of God's self-disclosure.
Mm.
And notice how different that is from a scientific hypothesis. So Karl Popper, in What is a Scientific Hypothesis, make sure it's falsifiable, that you can find something which would contradict, so that you can then basically go out in the world and look for contradictions. This form of inviting is a far cry from stating a hypothesis and then looking for the hammer that will break it. It's a different attitude. It'd be easy for me to say the attitude is charity, but I really want to evoke the word, then say it, because it has to do with expectation, which literally means from the heart, and going outside of one's way. What I like to think about is prayer, for instance. So if I'm going to sit down at my chair and write, I could just sit down in my chair and write, and then a bunch of things would come along and disturb that hypothesis for my future. I'll get a phone call, my stomach will rumble, etc. But if I stand up before I sit down and I walk over to a corner where I have a rosary and touch it for my own idiosyncratic reason and go out of my way the 5 steps and then come back, I've consecrated the moment. In and of itself, it's sacred because it's creation. But there's a distinction in the will between the reality that is sacred and the will's attempt to consecrate that for its own praise to God, the creator. That's where the particular lifts its head up to the universal. In the going out of one's way, even if it's 5 steps, it actually changes the world, even though in a Popperian sense, it's no hammer.
That's such a cool picture. Because one of the things that virtually every artist in the world struggles with, and I'm sure this is true whether it's writing or music or fine arts or whatever, painting, whatever, is that the minute you determine you're going to sit down and paint, every other thing comes into your head. Oh, well, I got to go clean the kitchen, I've got to straighten out this corner. You find every excuse, but all of those excuses are really, the creativity authors say that those excuses are coming out of your fear that you're not going to be good enough. But where does that fear really come from? The fear that I'm not going to be good enough is coming out of my human pride, that I'm doing this on my own, right? it's not consecrated. It's something I'm doing myself. The minute my attitude shifts to, it's not something that I'm going to do or get right because I'm so good at this and I have to worry about whether or not it's going to be good enough or anybody's going to like it or anything else. The minute I shift instead into that flow space of, I'm compelled to do this, and I'm in this flow space when I'm doing it, I'm no longer thinking about the fear or the pride or my personal expectations or any of that, right? I'm just doing the thing. And I think that's what you're talking about, that when you consecrate the moment, you can enter into that space where it's no longer you, but it's Christ in you. And therefore you don't have to be worrying about your own inadequacies.
And what's beautiful is it's open-ended. So you could do it on the way to a dentist appointment. You could consecrate the drilling because it is the peculiar that is consecrated, whatever the peculiar happens to be.
Yeah, and one thing Matt was mentioning charity, and I would want to substitute charity there, maybe to say eros instead, because, and this is Milbank was gesturing towards this in that video you shared as well, Matt, where there's a sort of seduction of us that takes place. That is God's work in this process. A sort of drawing out, a movement in directionality of our desire, when we're looking for it, and something of that is what's taking place in the flow state, right? There's this sort of reciprocal circular pattern where you're being drawn further into this thing, and part of the consummation of that work is a sort of oneness between you in the thing you're interacting with. And I think that's part of that's being alluded to here in this, both, this sort of human making being liturgy is God's sort of standing there in this sort of gap, and sort of seducing or putting something there to draw that interest out when we and so you're exactly right, that when you see it as a sort of participation with something larger than yourself, because in the other mode where you said the fear, what are you afraid of? What you're really afraid of is being exposed, of being naked, in terms of the inadequacy of what you're able to produce. Whereas this is something completely different. You're transfixed, right? You're drawn up into something larger than yourself, and it's not about you. The deeper in you get, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Pingstock, in her book After Writing, The Consummation of All Philosophy, uses the Phaedrus from Plato for her jumpstart to the eros that you were talking about, Michael. So she'll look at the Phaedrus where Socrates is having a conversation with another speech maker, and they're trying to go through the different manias people experience that they identify with love. So there's the mania of the prophet. It's all become transparent now. Let me show you. There's the mania of the one who is possessed by a body, another person's. There's other manias that we could adduce. Well, those manias people would rather have than not have in a life. They count it a natural good. They want to speak beyond themselves. They want to have erotic as well as placid moments. And so this divine madness is what he called it. This divine ecstasy, out of mindness, I think goes hand in hand with maybe a more sobering frame that is liturgical, right? The liturgy kind of frames those impulses, which if left unchecked, produces something like the Beat Generation in the 1950s, where it's all about the reportage of drug use and abuse for higher states of transcendent expulsion of eloquence. The liturgy promises that every minute of the day, but it comes at the cost of bringing the pedestrian into the sublime. You literally touch some stone with Jesus's carving on it. You don't get to go on the road and leave everything behind in a wild state of ecstasy.
Well, so
but you're given the same end as the faith.
that like connects up so well with the the idea of frame and boundary and limitations. And from my perspective, when I'm doing art, I am working within the framework that was built for me in what I learned about the elements and principles of art, which is kind of a liturgical frame, because every painting is going to have within it line and size and shape and direction and color and value and texture. And when I paint a line, I'm going to be thinking about what size line, what shape of a line, what texture of the line, what color. But then I'm also going to be thinking about, is that line bringing unity to the painting, which these are all the principles. Is it unifying? Is it harmonious? Is it contrasting or the same thing? Is it dominant in the painting, or is it not dominant? Is there repetition and gradation and variation and balance? I'm thinking about all those things, and that's a liturgical frame that reins it in. So I can't just throw paint at the canvas and say, cha-ching, somebody will buy this because it's pretty colors, right? Because I have a frame of what I'm trying to accomplish, and within that frame, I can see certain things, and I can keep coming back. Every time I get in a place where I don't quite know what to do, I can come back again with that frame and place it on and see, where am I now? You know, have I gotten to this place?
And that's how liturgy creates saints. In the same way that the elements of your art creates different practitioners of the art that can then stand in relation to one another in a tradition. Because there are so many variables within that finite frame, the self-expression is revealed as a disclosure of what your will did along the way. And that's how you can actually be ennobled through the will, not the epistemology that recognizes the elements, but the volitional that chooses this length of line versus that in this moment because of the thing over there in that quadrant. All of that, yes, it's specialized and it's epistemological, but the value is volitional. And it's what creates different masters.
Okay, so let me explore that a little bit. So if we're thinking about the volitional thing, the choices, one of the problems with that framework is that it creates too many choices, because every line goes through all the rest of the elements and all of the principles. So that's 56 right there. And then that's 56 only at the very basic level, but each one of those things has data compression built into them. And then every color, 256 million choices of color. And so now you've got this infinite potential. It's too much. You can't move forward. You're completely immobilized. So you have to have a boundary, a constraint. So you can manufacture a constraint for yourself and say, I'm going to paint the same subject over and over and over again, and see what changes can be made each time. So I've constrained myself down to one thing. And then I'm going to say, within this constraint, this time I'm going to constrain myself to these 3 colors, and I'm going to make line the dominant feature, or I'm going to make color the dominant feature. So I constrain even further. Now, is there something like that happening with liturgy? Is there something like that happening with life, where we put these constraints around to force ourselves into a space where we can create, become more creative?
This is the kenosis that Paul talks about, right? That God became nothing by a series of contractions to death on a cross and burial. And then the heartbeat and the escape and the founding of the church and the wedding and the explosion of, oh my God, John's walking in Jerusalem. Let's go talk to him and figure out what happened.
So it's the chiasm.
Yeah. And I just want, so that's the kenosis. And then liturgy is it's the concentric seismic ripple effects out from that, which are chiastic, right? They are remembrances. They're the Eucharist. And I think this is one of the reasons why we get patron saints, right? It's of all the saints in all existence, you're given one name, and that person leads you in imitation. Like you can't imitate the whole church, but you can imitate one little line of thought of your patron saint. And you believe that that line is part of the 56 Pentecostal starting of the heartbeat of Jesus in the kenosis. So it's this infinite compression and then infinite explosion on the basis of that unique event in all history. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it says the lamb was slaughtered before the foundation of the earth. That unique compression of the kenosis that made the Garden of Eden possible in its rule, in its data compression of choices.
Wow. Love you guys. I'm almost speechless, but I have this really big idea that I want to throw at you guys. When you think about, Michael, you were saying that you'd like to substitute eros for charity. So would you like to take just a minute to explain to everybody what eros means? Because I think we've tended to come, you know, usually in the biblical teaching, they talk about the 4 words for love, and agape is the unconditional love, and phileo is the brotherly love, and eros is the sexual love. But really, eros, when you're looking back at the philosophers, had a much bigger meaning than that, right?
Certainly, but I think, I mean, it always bespeaks of desire. But that desire itself becomes self-constraining, right? Because it leads you in a particular direction. It causes you to not see everything else that's in view, and to see this one thing and to be formed to it, in a sort of progression. And again, I think this is what, you know, really, like a lot of the early church fathers are gesturing towards. And you know, I think anytime you talk about the eros too, there's a danger with it, right? There's something explosive there, right? That explosion of possibility. So it does need to be reined in, and that's why the sort of the mundane, the pedestrian has to frame it, and this liturgy has to be there as a safeguard. But yeah, the God's, and it's strange there, because again, I think it's there is a volitional aspect in terms of you choosing to see and recognize this thing that's drawing you further in. But it is the work of God that is making it available and salient to you to make that decision. So in the end, it is God's work. But
Well,
you're saying that amen too.
When desire takes over, the volitional aspect becomes almost irrelevant, right? Because you're so drawn that you feel compelled, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so we take this charity and eros, where they're both aspects of love, and I'm thinking there's something in my head right now that's, and maybe you guys can think, we have to close up here pretty soon because Michael, you've got a hard stop at 11, but I mean at 1, guess we're on a different time schedule today. You guys can be thinking about this and help me see if I'm on a wrong track. I think there's some way in which love and information overlap, because in my mind, at the Big Bang, time and space and matter / energy came into being, but that's not enough, because matter and energy don't know what to do unless they have the laws of physics. So there has to be information at the beginning. So you have information and matter and energy. And information not knowledge. I know we tend to use information in a way that is unique because of technology, but there is another sense in which information is knowledge. Information is communication. And so that has to tie into the logos, the communication, there's something about the laws of physics that is this loving relationship, as you said, this reciprocal movement. But so I think there's some way in which information and love overlay each other.
So one way I conceptualize love is that you can just conceptualize it as two objects that come together, two things that become one. And in the process of those two things becoming one, both of them is dramatically changing shape to accommodate the other one, right? You know, obviously sex is the sort of thing that we think of with the erotic act, but you could generically just say any two things coming together, there's this deformation of one of the pieces in it and a forming to the other thing, right? And I think about this often in terms of even God's kenosis within the act of creation itself, so that the cross is sort of a pointing to something that is something that God's doing all the time in terms of this unfolding of what we see here, right? So that, you know, it says in John 3:16, God so loved the cosmos. That is the structure of this of everything, right? Of the universe, right? That's why we use cosmology for, you know, the study of the universe and its origins. It's God in time and space, canonically emptying himself to come into contact with what we think of as finite being and to animate it and to direct it. And so all those properties of quote unquote information that you are referring to, they're all things that God is bringing to the table in terms of his being that allows the logos, which is the sun that's sent forth into the world, to give it its proper structure for the telos that God has in mind,
So
which
love
is
formational. Love is formational, right?
right. And what is the telos, right? The telos is the wedding supper of the Lamb, where heaven and earth are finally united, where the church and Jesus are intertwined, and the body becomes whole. Or there's a sense in which these things that we're kind of like in this transitional phase of that taking place.
And to now combine this with Joseph and the whale, or Jake, the one that was swallowed by the whale, I always forget his name, Jonah, yeah. He was spit out, and this is a picture of resurrection. Jesus Christ used it himself and said this was the sign of his messiahship. And the idea in Genesis that we are in the imago Dei. Well, if God is the infinite, you couldn't possibly picture him. And yet that's what we are. So how is this possible? As Mike was saying, and as you said, with the illustration of all the rules of projection on paint with surfaces and shape, literally the kenosis would have had to be prior to creation. It would have had to be something incipient and within the nature of God himself in order then to say that's what we are. So we are dying and resurrecting beings by design, because that is the nature of God. And maybe that's what it means, the image of God. We will die and then we will wake up. Just as we go to sleep, or we have a vigil and we don't go to sleep, but then we eventually go to sleep and then we wake up again. I sometimes think about this. Wow, I don't remember what happened to me while I was sleeping. I went somewhere and then I came back. Mm-hmm. Here I am. I can never go back again. I can only go forward to the next sleep. That is a liturgical movement. It's a passing of the time.
Well, and every time, you know, Jordan Peterson's always talking about this, every time you learn, a little part of you is dying. The old thought has to go away and a new one comes, and you're always dying and being reborn all the time. And every time you sacrifice for somebody that you love. There's part of you that's dying off and another part coming on. And yeah, this has been so great, guys. I am really excited for part 5. Because I'm really surprised, because when I first read that paragraph, I thought, what on earth is he talking about? And now I have a much richer, fuller understanding of it because of you two wonderful human beings. And I'm so thankful for your friendship. And let's get together again. You guys let me know what your schedule looks like.
Definitely.
Thank you, Karen.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thanks, Karen.
Bye-bye. Have a
Bye,
great
guys.
See ya.